introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. Flannery O'Connor was once invited to address a group about man's ultimate concern. And she said, well, I'm going to have to enter this conversation at a slightly lower level than that. Well, I'm going to have to enter this conversation at a slightly lower level than Father Rutler. I did not have Catholic education, didn't know about the Trivium, or St. Sylvester, the Battle of Lepanto, the Salve Regina, a lot of other things that Father Rutler touched on. Somehow I muddled through to the point where I've been asked to speak to you today. So I'm just going to have to tell a few stories and offer a few insights about some other people who muddled through without the benefit of Catholic K-12 education. I've been invited to speak here because I'm the author of a book called The Life You Save May Be Your Own. It's a group portrait of 4 American Catholic writers: Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. It emerged during the remarks when we spoke before sitting down that one of the models for the book was Matheson's American Renaissance, which is a book about 4 American writers doing their major work at the same time in close proximity. Hawthorne, Melville, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman. 3 of those writers are Massachusetts writers, so I was really grateful to have that connection made and realize again one of the sources of the book. It's a group portrait of 4 great American Catholic writers, and in the 13 years since the book was published, I've not once been invited to speak about it or about its subjects by an institution of Roman Catholic K-12 education. So I'm glad to be here speaking to you instead. I wondered, why would that be? Possibly 544 pages, the book is too long for K-12 students and their teachers. Possibly the material is considered objectionable. There's an abortion in the book, and the person who had it is now on the path to sainthood. There's a child born out of wedlock. And that person, the father of that child, winds up a renowned Trappist monk. There's an affair in the book involving 2 artists, and one of them is a famous Catholic novelist. I don't think those are the reasons, though. I don't think it's worth figuring out, really, why that invitation has never come. The real thing to ponder, the real surprise, is how could it be that these 4 great American modern Catholic writers, 2 of whom were put forward by Pope Francis in his address to Congress as representative Americans, Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. Of those 4, only one of them had any direct experience of Roman Catholic K-12 education, Flannery O'Connor. How could that be? Is that somehow part of Providence or God's design that these people should enter the church from some other way? Could it be that that period worldly education really was superior to Catholic education? Could it be, and this is to me closest to the truth, that in that post-war era, American Catholics were insecure about their faith and insecure about their education, such that they needed some external validation, and they looked to writers who had come to the faith as adults, and that somehow said to cradle Catholics, wow, you've really got something here. If Thomas Merton, who went to Cambridge and Columbia, chose to be part of this tradition, if Walker Percy from this planter family, raised by a Harvard graduate, chose to be a Roman Catholic, you've really got something here. The point I'm making is that 3 of the 4 were converts, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Walker Percy, and the 4th, Flannery O'Connor, who went to St. Vincent's Grammar School in Savannah, was preoccupied with conversion, with a threshold experience of religious faith and the acceptance or rejection of Christ. But the fact that 3 of them had no experience of Catholic education does raise the question, well, if those 4 great American Catholic writers, again, 2 of them put forward by Pope Francis, came to the church as adults and thrived, well, is Roman Catholic K-12 education really so vital? That's a question that you all are better equipped to answer than I. and the question of whether it's vital and how it's going to be vital in the future. So for myself, I just like to tell a story of something that I learned writing this book about them, something that might be useful in your own experience of Catholic K-12 education as you go back to your schools. And maybe this is something a lot more compact than a 544-page book that you can find useful. As I set out to write the book, I kept noticing in the work of these four writers this word pilgrimage showing up again and again. Dorothy Day's column in The Catholic Worker was called On Pilgrimage. Merton's movement from worldly education into a Trappist monastery, then an interior movement that led him to be drawn to writers of the Middle Ages, of Asia, of the beat poet movement, etc., was characterized as a pilgrimage. Walker Percy characterized the human person as a pilgrim and wayfarer, and said that endlessly in interviews and essays, glossing his own work. So I noticed this again and again, so I figured out, well, I guess the story I'm trying to tell is in some way the story of a pilgrimage. But then I realized I didn't have any firm idea of what a pilgrimage is. So I looked in their work, looked in other places, still didn't find a satisfactory definition of what a pilgrimage is. So I found myself working up an idea of a pilgrimage from their work and trying to make my book an expression of what a pilgrimage is, in the way of my college roommate, who then became a graduate student in physics, experimental physics. In order to perform the experiment that he had chosen as his master's topic, he first had to develop the instruments that he would need to collect the data that would validate the experiment. So I had to construct this definition of pilgrimage in order to tell the story of these four writers as a pilgrimage. And here's what I came up with. A pilgrimage is a journey taken in the light of a story. The story precedes us, and we enter that story in the middle. Others have already been involved in that story. We go on a path as pilgrims that have been taken by others before us. That is to say, we're not pioneers. We're not breaking new ground. The path is already out there, and we're going to follow this path, in part because others have, the evidence says, taken it fruitfully before us. So with that in mind, we want to go ourselves. Pilgrims travel in company. Think of the company that Dante had in Virgil, or the company of the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. But pilgrims go to this holy destination with the objective of seeing individually with their own eyes. It's not enough just to be along in the pilgrimage. You're going to the shrine of Thomas of Becket or whatever, see something for yourself. And you're going not just to see something, you're not just a tourist. The pilgrim is going hoping, praying to be changed by the experience, to see something or have an encounter that will lead to change. And the pilgrim, having had the experience, having seen what there is to see on pilgrimage, then returns to ordinary life and tells others about the experience, thus perpetuating the pattern of pilgrimage for others and for future generations. How does this pertain to the stories of four American writers? Well, the pattern of pilgrimage is also a pattern of reading and writing. And to exfoliate that pattern took 544 pages. But let me just give you an example from their life. One example from each of the four lives to try to give a sense of what I mean. Dorothy Day, growing up in Chicago, was an avid reader. She read Dickens, she read Tolstoy, and she read the muckraking novelists who set their work in Chicago. So she was pushing her younger brother in a pram on the west side of Chicago and realized that the novels of Frank Norris took place very near to where she herself lived. And this was an awesome experience for her to realize that literature happened in a place very close to her own life. She then sought, through her 20s, to find a place where people were living lives as she understood them to be lived in literature? Where were the people who cared for one another like the characters in Dickens? Where were people who were animated by concern for the meaning of life like those in Dostoevsky? She sought it in various progressive movements, in anarchism, in politics, and she found it in the Roman Catholic Church, which had its own text that people spent their lives, a story that people were trying to follow with their own lives, of course, the Gospels. Thomas Merton, he was a graduate student at Columbia. He found his way through his dissertation on William Blake and Hopkins to medieval philosophy, and realized with a kind of awe that this philosophy was actually still being lived out by monks in monasteries right here in the United States. And when he got to the Abbey of Gethsemane for a retreat, it was like the books made actual, that medieval philosophy was being lived by monks in Kentucky. It was a shattering experience, and life being lived according to those books, and it's a life that, of course, he sought to live himself. Walker Percy grew up in a Southern literary tradition. His uncle, who raised him, was a very late romantic poet, I would characterize him that way. And Percy grew up familiar with Walter Scott and writers like that. But after the war, he had tuberculosis. He found himself attracted to a very different kind of novel. Existentialist novels, Sartre and Camus, anguish and a sense of life's purposefulness and the lonely individual dissociated from society. And for some reason, those protagonists spoke to his situation as a well-born Southerner from a very rich tradition, more than the characteristic literature of the South or the great tradition. So he sought to make work that was distinctively Southern and Catholic, but that drew on that existentialist tradition. So from The Stranger, he went to The Moviegoer. And if you look at the opening passages of the two novels, they're strikingly alike. Flannery O'Connor, she did have a Catholic education through grammar school. She wound up going to public high school in Millersville, Georgia, and then to public university. Father Rutler's disdainful remark about the social science would have landed well in Flannery O'Connor's ears. She studied social science and spent the rest of her life rebelling against it and affirming the attention to the individual and to the unpredictable that as core qualities of fiction because they were defined as social science. So she got to the University of Iowa, very good writer already, but without a firm sense of the story she should be telling. And she, at that point, in the North for the first time, realized that the scriptures, and the Hebrew Bible in particular, the people described there were akin to the people that she had known growing up in the South. And this parallel, or this connection between the scriptures and her own experience growing up in the South was the key that she needed for her work as a Catholic writer to write about non-Catholics in biblical situations in the South. Suddenly her work really took off when she had grasped that the scriptures had a descriptive aspect that applied to the society she knew well. She suddenly had something to write about. So again, pilgrimage is a journey undertaken in the light of a story. The story precedes us. We enter it in the middle. We go to see what others have seen on a path already taken by others. We travel in company, but we aim to see individually, and we hope and pray to be changed in the encounter, and then to return and tell others about the experience. So this pattern makes a few assumptions about education and about reading that might be worth underscoring if we're talking about Catholic K-12 education. Assumptions that may be obvious, but may not be. One is that this pattern, as I've described it, involves the reading of books. And that's whole books. I think, and I know partly from the experience of watching students at Georgetown and watching my own children, how common it is for students to be assigned excerpts from books. Flannery O'Connor is usually known to high school students because She wrote short stories. You could teach just 2 or 3 of them. So the reading of books and the reading of whole books, because books create a pattern that the student can enter into. Another assumption underlying this pattern that I just set out is that Catholicism has a history. O'Connor once said, or she gave this title of one of her remarks, literature is a subject with a history and should be taught that way. In the same way, Catholicism has a history, the history that Father Rutler alluded to, but also has a modern history and an American history and a literary history. So if we're going to understand, so let's say, the works of these writers, we need to be able to understand those things and how those writers fit into that history and how they open up that history to us. A third thing to keep in mind is that the Catholic Church really is Catholic, and that there's a diversity of Catholic experience such that, and I found this again and again as I wrote the book, there are often 4 different approaches to the same question or quandary. It was pretty interesting to, say, look at the election of John F. Kennedy of the Vietnam War and see how Flannery O'Connor responded to it, how Dorothy Day responded to it, how Thomas Merton responded to it, and how Walker Percy responded to it. 4 thoughtful, faithful, committed Catholics, and a range of responses. No unanimity on many issues. It was very instructive to see, and I think something that it's hard for us to convey as well as we ought to. So those 3 assumptions, but I would say that the key assumption is the one that I mentioned when I was describing the pattern of pilgrimage itself. And it's this notion that we are to be changed by the experience. The 4 writers in my book are converts. They are, in William James's formulation, twice born rather than once born. In the formulation favored by evangelical Christians, they're born again. Students in the K to 12 years are still young. They're still being formed. Flannery O'Connor said, the student's case should not be consulted. It is being formed. And yet, even as Catholicism and a sense of the liberal arts tradition is being instilled, I think we need to keep ourselves alive to the fact that the student is already in a position to be changed, already comes to education with experience, looking to be changed and willing to be changed, and changed in a fruitful direction. So educators, I think, need to keep that in mind, and also we need to keep in mind our own capacity to be changed through literature, the process of education, and through the conversation between the elders and the younger, and teachers and students, that presumably this kind of education is all about. As I looked at these writers' stories, keeping in mind that they, with the exception of O'Connor, didn't have direct experience of K-12 Catholic education, I thought to myself, well, what encounters did they have? And I just found a few remarks that I think I can put forward as addenda, really, before yielding to the next speaker. Dorothy Day gave a lot of talks. She traveled around the country speaking to Catholic worker groups, the ones that would have her, and at Catholic colleges. And then one, she showed up at a Catholic college and she was surprised by a large crowd for her talk. It was much larger than usual. She thought, wow, this is some crowd for a talk on saints and heroes, which is her topic. Well, it turned out that the flyer had advertised a talk on saints and eros. And I have to say, if an advertised talk on saints and eros today drew a large crowd, I'd be surprised. Thomas Merton, in the middle 60s, he was struggling with he really struggled since 1949, with the legacy of the Seven-Story Mountain and its popularity, the fact that it was an early work, it was a narrow work, that it created a public reputation for him that he struggled to fulfill and struggled to evade at the same time. So he griped that the book is now inflicted on school children, and so doubtless must be representative of its author. And yet, the same figure in the Seven-Story Mountain marveled at the fact that the ideas, the doctrines that were changing his life as a graduate student at Columbia were ideas and doctrines that were common knowledge to Catholic school children around the United States. That they knew these things that he was only now beginning to learn was a revelation to him. Walker Percy liked to quote Kierkegaard's remark about Hegel, that Hegel had erected the beautiful palace of his philosophy, but lived in a shack outside. That is to say, Hegel, in Kierkegaard's view, had created a philosophy that explained everything, except what it is to be born, to live, and to die. To put it a little differently, Percy sometimes liked to say, describe people who got straight A's but flunked life. Flannery O'Connor, in the same direction, spoke about a certain grain of stupidity that a novelist had to have. This was the grain of stupidity that kept her from being preoccupied with what the intellectuals said and kept her eye on the prize. She would get letters from students sometimes asking her things about her work. And one of the questions she would get from high school students was, why does Hazel Motes, protagonist of Wise Blood, preacher of the Church Without Christ, why does Hazel Motes wear a hat? So O'Connor replied, to cover his head. Then, at Catholic Women's College, I believe, O'Connor was asked, Miss O'Connor, why do you write? She said, because I'm good at it. She sensed considerable disapproval in the atmosphere. And this, to me, is, in roundabout fashion, the answer to the question that I posed about how these four great writers, American Catholics, could get where they got without the benefit of a Catholic K-12 education. It's the mystery of individual gifts and talents. And I hope that all of us in this room, as we think systematically and in a thoroughgoing way about what Catholic education means, we keep in sight this mystery of individual gifts and talents, and it's finally about the students as individual people. And we can do that, and from the drift of the language in the room, the suggestion is that we can do that better than other approaches to education. I'm certainly hoping that's the case. Thank you.